There's a moment in every woman's life when she realizes that the world she experiences is shaped far more by the landscape within her than the circumstances around her. And when that realization arrives, quietly, subtly, or sometimes in a flash, it becomes the beginning of a new kind of intelligence. Smart women know that the first rule they follow isn't about strategy or efficiency or how to win at life. It's about tending to the inner world with the same care and reverence one might give a garden. Because before a decision is ever made, before a word is spoken, before a boundary is drawn or a dream is pursued, there is a thought, a feeling, a whisper of intuition. And that subtle inner movement is the true source of their power. So they start there. They begin by listening to themselves, really listening, without judgment, without rushing to categorize their emotions as right or wrong. They understand that their inner voice is not an enemy to be silenced, but a compass to be honored. And the remarkable thing is, once they commit to this quiet inward attention, the noise outside loses its authority. Opinions loses its pull, and the frantic pace of the world no longer dictates their will. They cultivate this inner world through honesty, first and foremost. Not the brutal kind of honesty that condemns, but the compassionate honesty that illuminates. When they are tired, they admit it. When something hurts, they acknowledge it. When they want more love, more respect, more opportunity, they stop pretending otherwise. They become fluent in the truth of their own experience, and because of that, they move through life with a rare clarity. Smart women also understand that their inner world must be grounded in self-trust. They learn to trust the subtle signals of their intuition, the uneasy tightening in the stomach, the sudden spark of excitement, the quiet sense that a room or a person just isn't quite right. They don't demand that intuition deliver a fully articulated explanation. They simply trust its guidance, knowing that the deepest intelligence often speaks in feelings rather than words. And because they trust themselves, they become far less dependent on external validation. Approval is pleasant but not necessary. Validation is appreciated but not required. And this self-trust creates an inner stillness, a sense of being anchored, even in uncertain times. Smart women know how to return to that stillness when the world becomes too loud. They know how to pause before reacting, how to breathe before deciding, how to check in with themselves instead of rushing reflexively into what others expect. They become, in a way, their own sanctuary. From this sanctuary emerges another quiet but essential rule: emotional responsibility. Smart women take ownership of their emotions without weaponizing them against themselves. They don't shame themselves for feeling deeply, nor do they outsource their emotional state to another person's behavior. Instead, they become curious. Why did that upset me? Why did that inspire me? Why did that moment awaken something I didn't know I had buried? They explore their inner responses, not to control them, but to understand them. Because understanding is what brings real freedom. This inner world also holds their boundaries. Boundaries aren't walls. They are expressions of inner clarity. Smart women know that boundaries originate not from anger, but from self-respect. They don't set boundaries to shut people out, but to honor what they know to be true about their energy, their time, and their emotional well-being. And because they've done the work within, their boundaries are calm, firm, and consistent. Not dramatic, not reactive, simply aligned. When a woman moves through the world from this inner foundation, something extraordinary happens. She stops seeking life and begins creating it. She stops chasing and starts attracting. She stops shrinking herself to fit into small spaces and begins expanding into the shape she was always meant to hold. She becomes someone who is not controlled by circumstance, but guided by her own depth. And from that depth, she carries a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. It is felt, it is lived, It is the result of walking through life with the understanding that everything meaningful, every boundary, every dream, every act of courage begins within. And so the first rule is not a rule at all, but a remembering that the most intelligent thing a woman can do is to master the art of caring for her inner world, because everything else takes shape from there. This is where her power begins. There is a kind of subtle wisdom that arises when a woman realizes her time, her energy, and her attention are not infinite resources to be scattered around freely, but sacred forms of currency. And when she finally recognizes their value, something in her shifts. She no longer rushes to stretch herself thin to meet every expectation. She no longer apologizes for needing space. She no longer feels compelled to pour into situations that give nothing back. Instead, she begins to treat her life as something exquisitely precious, something that deserves careful tending rather than constant depletion. Smart women understand that every choice they make is, in its own way, an investment. Some choices nourish them, others drain them. Some leave them clearer, others leave them tangled. They begin to see that their attention is not simply a casual glance. It is a beam of awareness that shapes whatever it lands on. When they give that attention to chaos, chaos grows. When they give it to peace, peace expands. And when they give it to their own growth, they evolve in ways that feel almost effortless. Now, what's remarkable is how this understanding doesn't make them rigid. It makes them free. They stop saying yes out of obligation, out of habit, out of fear of disappointing someone. They learn that a yes given reluctantly is far more damaging than a no given with honesty. They see that every time they overextend themselves, they are not being kind, they are betraying their own well-being. And so they learn the graceful art of the intentional yes and the unapologetic no. This shift naturally alters the way they move through the world. They begin to guard their mornings because they know the early hours shape the entire day. They become protective of their mental space because they know how easily negativity can seep in and blur their clarity. They choose conversations more carefully, recognizing that certain exchanges feed the mind while others exhaust the soul. And perhaps most importantly, they stop engaging in battles that drain them, arguments that go nowhere, relationships that never change, patterns that have run their course. In this protection of their energy, something tender emerges, a deeper appreciation for rest. Not the forced rest that comes after burnout, but the restorative stillness that is chosen willingly. Smart women no longer see rest as laziness or indulgence, but as maintenance of their inner equilibrium. They understand that rest is not an escape from productivity, it is a part of it. Rest allows them to return to life with sharper intuition, steadier emotions, and a renewed sense of direction. They also become deliberate with where they place their emotional energy. They refuse to pour themselves into people who treat their kindness as an unlimited source. They stop chasing after those who only offer inconsistency. They stop explaining themselves to those determined not to understand. Instead, they invest in people who reciprocate, who listen, who meet them where they stand. They nurture relationships that offer presence rather than pressure. And they let go of the ones that only survive through their effort alone. In all this, smart women recognize that distractions, both obvious and subtle, have a way of stealing life in small increments. They notice how easily one can drift away from purpose by focusing on what is trivial, petty, or temporary. So they simplify. They declutter their environments, their commitments, and even their digital spaces. They realize that a life filled with unnecessary noise leaves no room for meaningful sound. And so they make space for clarity, space for creativity, space for the things that truly matter. And these, over time, This commitment to protecting their time and energy becomes less about discipline and more about devotion. It becomes a gentle honoring of themselves. They begin to feel different, lighter, yet more grounded, spacious, yet more focused. They notice that opportunities arrive more naturally, that decisions become easier, that relationships grow healthier, simply because they are no longer operating from depletion. And with this newfound spaciousness, they discover something quietly profound. When a woman protects her energy, life stops feeling like a frantic chase and begins to feel like a steady unfolding. She no longer lives in reaction to the world, she moves in harmony with it. She becomes intentional, deliberate, and deeply centered in her own experience, because she has finally understood that her energy is not just hers to give away, but hers to preserve, shape, and elevate. And there comes a time when a woman realizes that the people she surrounds herself with are not merely participants in her life, but reflections of her inner state. The quality of her relationships shapes the quality of her mind, her mood, even her sense of possibility. Smart women understand this instinctively. They know that the company they keep is like the atmosphere they breathe, subtle, invisible, yet profoundly influential. And so they choose wisely, not out of superiority, but out of self-respect. They begin to notice how certain people expand them while others compress them. Some conversations leave them clearer, others leave them feeling scattered. Some people bring out their strength, others draw out their self-doubt. And instead of ignoring these signals, as many do for the sake of comfort or habit, they take them seriously, because smart women listen to the way their body reacts around others. They feel the ease, the tension, the resonance, the dissonance. They do not force connection where there is none, and they do not cling to closeness that has already dissolved. What's remarkable is that they don't approach relationships with calculation, but with presence. They know that real connection cannot be rushed or fabricated. It emerges naturally when two people meet one another openly. And so they show up as they are, without masks, without performative pleasantries, without trying to make themselves smaller or more palatable. They trust that the right people will recognize them, just as they are, and the wrong people will simply drift away. There is a quiet liberation in allowing this natural sorting to unfold. In their friendships, they seek depth rather than breadth. A handful of real companions is worth more than a crowd of acquaintances. They gravitate toward people who challenge them kindly, who celebrate their wins without hesitation, who can sit with them in moments of uncertainty without offering shallow advice. They value those who speak truth without cruelty, who understand without needing lengthy explanations, who bring warmth without conditions. And they reciprocate in equal measure. Smart women don't simply demand high-quality relationships. They embody them. They listen with sincere attention. They show up when it counts. They speak honestly, even when honesty feels vulnerable. They invest in the emotional lives of those they love, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. Their presence becomes a kind of steadying force, one that others can trust and lean into. In romantic relationships, they recognize the difference between chemistry and alignment. Chemistry may spark excitement, but alignment sustains connection. Smart women are drawn to partners who match their emotional maturity, their aspirations, their values, partners who understand that love is not possession, but presence. They seek relationships where growth is mutual, communication is open, and respect is non-negotiable. They let go of the idea that love should be earned or chased, and instead embrace the quiet truth that real love is reciprocal by nature. And when a relationship no longer honors them, they do not cling from fear or nostalgia. They grieve, yes, because letting go is never easy, but they do not stay where their spirit is dimmed. They know that holding on to something that no longer fits is one of the quickest ways to lose oneself. So they release what is misaligned to create space for what is meant. It is not coldness, it is clarity. Interestingly, this clarity extends beyond people to the environments they choose. Smart women gravitate towards spaces where kindness is the default, where inspiration flows naturally, where they feel more awake, more aware, more authentically themselves. They avoid the subtle toxicity of gossip, the heaviness of chronic complaint, the numbness of people who are endlessly distracted. They choose spaces where their mind feels nourished. Over time, their relationships become a reflection of who they've become within. They no longer attract chaos because they no longer tolerate it. They no longer attract people who drain them because they've learned to protect their energy. They no longer attract partners who diminish them because they've built a life where diminishing themselves is no longer possible. And from this place, surrounded by people who bring out their brilliance, a smart woman begins to feel the fullness of her own presence. Her relationships elevate her, not because she demands it, but because she has aligned herself with those who resonate with her growth, her peace, her purpose. And through that alignment, she becomes a living example of this simple truth. The connections you choose can either shrink your life or they can help it flourish. There is a quiet strength in a woman who learns to look beyond the immediacy of the moment and sense the long arc of her life unfolding. Smart women understand that the present, while vivid and pressing, is only one brushstroke on a much larger canvas. They don't allow temporary circumstances to dictate permanent decisions. Instead, they hold a vision, a gentle but steady awareness of who they are becoming, and they allow that vision to shape the choices they make today. They begin to notice how easy it is to be pulled into urgency, to react to whatever rises first, to chase quick comforts rather than meaningful progress. But they also notice how unsatisfying that way of living becomes. It keeps the mind busy, but the spirit stagnant. So they step back, they breathe, they ask themselves not just what they want right now, but what they will be grateful for 10 years from now. And suddenly, the decisions that once felt complicated begin to simplify. They stop choosing based on fear or boredom or pressure from the world around them. They start choosing based on alignment with the future they've quietly begun shaping. This long-term vision is not rigid. It's not a strict, narrow path. It's more like a guiding star. Something steady enough to orient them, yet spacious enough to allow life to unfold with its surprises and detours. Smart women understand that a vision is not about controlling the future, but about staying in dialogue with it. They listen closely to the direction life pulls them, and they adjust their course with grace rather than resistance. One of the ways this vision shows itself is in the way they handle their money. They see financial decisions not as isolated transactions, but as part of a larger story of stability, freedom, and choice. They become thoughtful about what they spend on, what they save for, and what they invest in, not out of scarcity, but out of an understanding that financial peace supports emotional peace. They don't chase material things to fill emotional gaps. They build resources that sustain their independence. Money becomes less about status and more about sovereignty. Their long-term vision also shapes the way they pursue personal growth. Smart women invest in skills that will serve their future selves. They commit to learning, not always because they need to, but because they value the expansion it brings. They follow curiosities that may not offer immediate rewards, but open unexpected doors. They make time for reflection because they know that wisdom comes not from speed, but from depth. Growth becomes a lifelong companion rather than a short sprint to self-improvement. And in their relationships, this vision becomes a quiet filter. They choose partners and friends not just for how they make them feel today, but for whether they can walk alongside them into the life they are building. They ask themselves whether the connection supports their growth, whether it respects their boundaries, whether it honors their dreams. They no longer stay in relationships that require them to minimize their aspirations. They don't settle for someone who merely fits their present. They choose someone who can coexist with their becoming. Smart women also learn not to fear patience. They understand that meaningful things take time, sometimes longer than expected. They stop comparing their timeline to anyone else's because they see how deeply personal the unfolding of a life truly is. They realize that haste often leads to detours, while patience allows clarity to catch up with them. And so they let things ripen in their own time, trusting that what is meant for them will not pass them by as long as they remain open, aligned, and attentive. This long-term perspective gives them a sense of calm around uncertainty. Instead of panicking when life takes an unexpected turn, they draw on deeper knowing that every twist and shift is part of their evolution. They recognize that setbacks are not dead ends, but redirections. They stop seeing changes as losses and begin to see them as invitations, opportunities to refine their vision, to strengthen their resilience, to deepen their trust in themselves. And what emerges from this commitment to long-term vision is a life that feels intentional rather than accidental. They start moving with a kind of quiet assurance, a peaceful confidence that comes from knowing they are shaping something meaningful. Their days become more purposeful, their choices more aligned, and their path more coherent. They stop drifting and start directing. In this way, a smart woman becomes a creator of her own destiny, not by force or control, but by clarity, patience, and unwavering self-trust. She understands that the future is not something she waits for. It is something she consciously, lovingly builds. And in building it, she becomes unstoppable. The moment she begins to live by choice rather than by default. There comes a moment when a woman begins to recognize that the world around her is full of borrowed definitions. Definitions of success, beauty, ambition, femininity, strength. They swirl around her like patterns she never quite agreed to, yet somehow was expected to follow. And in that moment of recognition, she feels the quiet pull to step back from all the noise and ask herself a question few people dare to ask. What do I actually want my life to mean? Smart women understand that true intelligence begins when they choose their own standard, rather than surrendering to the standards handed to them by others. They realize that society has a way of whispering expectations into their ears long before they are old enough to examine them. Be agreeable, be impressive, be productive, be perfect. And without meaning to, many women shape themselves around these whispers, bending and contorting to fit into expectations that never belong to them. But smart women begin to sense the weight of that performance, and they decide, quietly but firmly, that their life will not be a performance at all. That they understand that trying to meet everyone's standards is the fastest way to lose their own. And so they begin the courageous work of letting go of the pressure to appear a certain way, achieve a certain way, love a certain way. They stop chasing approval as though it were oxygen. They stop living for applause they don't even believe in. They stop measuring their worth through the lens of comparison, because they realize comparison is nothing more than a distortion, a trick of the mind that shrinks their truth. When a woman releases these borrowed expectations, something astonishing happens. She starts to hear her own voice again, the voice that was always there beneath the layers of noise. It speaks softly at first, almost shyly, because it's so often been drowned out. But as she listens, that voice grows steadier, clearer. It tells her what feels meaningful, what feels honest, what feels aligned. And the more she listens, the more she trusts it. But eventually she recognizes that this voice, not the voices around her, is the true compass of her life. Smart women learn that their intuition cannot be standardized. Their rhythm cannot be synchronized to someone else's timeline. Their purpose cannot be contained in neat little categories. They see that life is not a checklist but an unfolding. So instead of forcing themselves into predefined shapes, they choose the shape that feels most authentic. They allow themselves to evolve, not according to cultural milestones, but according to inner wisdom. And this wisdom teaches them something profoundly freeing. They don't need to shrink themselves to be accepted, nor do they need to inflate themselves to be admired. They simply need to be themselves, wholly and unapologetically. They learn that authenticity is not a rebellion, it is a return. Back to the essence that was always there beneath the conditioning. What's remarkable is how this internal shift begins to transform their outer world. When a woman stops measuring herself through external standards, her confidence becomes quieter but deeper. She no longer seeks attention, she radiates presence. She no longer tries to fit in, she naturally stands out. The world responds differently to a woman who is anchored in herself. She is not easily swayed, not easily manipulated, not easily impressed by surface-level things. She moves through life with a kind of effortless clarity. And because she no longer clings to external approval, she becomes willing to take risks she once avoided. She says no where she used to say yes. She pursues opportunities she once felt unworthy of. She expresses truths she once swallowed. She walks away from situations that cannot meet her standards, not those projected onto her. She becomes aware that the life she builds from her own inner standard will always be richer, deeper, and more fulfilling than any life built on borrowed expectations. And even though such a life may not always look conventional, it feels profoundly right. It feels like hers. In living this way, aligned, authentic, and unapologetically rooted in her own truth, she discovers a kind of power that cannot be taken, only cultivated. She becomes the author of her own story, not an actress in someone else's script. And once she realizes that, she never returns to the smaller version of herself she once tried to be, because a woman who holds herself to her own standard becomes a force that cannot be shaped by the world. She becomes a force that shapes it. Throughout this journey we've taken together, there has been a single thread running through every idea, every reflection, every truth we explored. A woman's power does not come from the world outside her, but from the depth she cultivates within herself. When she begins to understand this, her entire life starts to shift, not dramatically at first, but subtly, steadily, like the turning of a tide. She discovers that the greatest strength she possesses lies in her ability to listen inwardly, to honor her own needs, to protect the sanctity of her time and energy, and to surround herself with people who speak to her higher self rather than her fears. And as she grows in this awareness, she starts to see her life not as a collection of scattered moments, but as an unfolding story guided by intention. She learns to shape her decisions with the wisdom of the future in mind, seeing beyond the immediacy of discomfort or desire, and instead aligning herself with what will nourish her in the long run. She becomes patient where she once felt pressure. She becomes discerning where she once felt obligated, and she becomes creative where she once felt constrained. Her life begins to feel like her own, not a performance, not a reaction, not an accommodation, but an expression of her truest nature. What makes this transformation so profound is that it happens quietly. It does not require grand announcements or dramatic gestures. It requires only that she choose herself with consistency and honesty. It requires that she trusts the subtle voice within her that has been whispering truths she once ignored. It requires that she step into relationships that expand her and release the ones that diminish her. And most of all, it requires that she hold herself to a standard shaped not by the world's expectations, but by the timeless wisdom of her own inner knowing. When a woman begins to live this way, in harmony with her intuition, in alignment with her purpose, in respect for her own boundaries, her presence becomes unmistakably different. She moves with a grounded calm because she is no longer pulled by every passing current. She radiates a quiet confidence because she no longer bargains for validation. She experiences love more deeply because she no longer accepts anything less than reciprocity. She creates a life that feels whole, not because it is perfect, but because it is true. And perhaps this is the heart of it all. A smart woman becomes powerful not by striving to be more, but by remembering who she already is. She recognizes her worth without needing it confirmed. She honors her path without seeking permission. She owns her voice without softening it to fit someone else's comfort. And in doing so, she becomes the architect of a life that reflects her courage, her clarity, and her capacity for growth. So as we close this journey, let this truth settle deeply within you. Everything you seek is already within you, waiting for your attention, your respect, your willingness to listen. When you honor that inner wisdom, life opens in ways you could never have imagined. And when you choose to live from that place, you become unstoppable, not through force, but through understanding. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your openness. And may life continue to rise to meet you in every step you take. God bless you.